Hi everyone, welcome. I'm just going to do a quick intro. Welcome to this exciting talk. This is being sponsored by the Berkeley Network for Political Economy, which I think some of you will have heard of before, some won't, which is a Hewlett Foundation sponsored project to sort of rethink political economy after neoliberalism, and interdisciplinary projects sort of both within Berkeley and across with other institutions. I'm not going to go on about it at length, but I'm going to put a link to our website in the chat. And a link to a piece in the Boston Review by our co-chairs Neil Fligstein and Steve Vogel. Quickly, in terms of admin, we are recording this because we will put it up on our website. So if you don't want to be videoed, turn your screen off. We will take questions via the chat and in person, I think, probably at the end. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Professor Mark Brilliant from History of Berkeley.
Thank you all, and thank you, Elizabeth. Before I introduce our rock star professor speaker, which turned out a Friday afternoon Zoom talk attendance, sort of that's analogous to Springsteen at the Meadowlands, I suppose. I want to first clarify how I'll be directing the Q&A traffic as moderator, since there's many more of you out there than my little laptop at home here has Zoom cubicles for me to sort of identify if you're waving your hand. So I'm just going to take questions in the order they appear in the chat. So you can either indicate in the chat that you have a question, just write down, I have a question or question. Or if you'd rather not speak and get recorded when your turn in the queue comes, just type out your question in the chat and I'll read it for you. So having clarified that, it's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Elizabeth Anderson, AKA the philosopher redefining equality, as per the title of a wonderful recent New Yorker profile of her. Professor Anderson grew up in Connecticut. She earned her BA at Swarthmore, her PhD in philosophy at Harvard, where John Rawls served as her dissertation chair. She's the author of several books, including most recently Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Think About It, as well as countless articles in academic and mainstream venues. She's also the recipient of numerous awards, including a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2019. Professor Anderson's scholarship has earned her the position she currently holds at the University of Michigan as the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies, while her pedagogy has earned her the Arthur Thurnau Professorship for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Until recently, Professor Anderson was also the John Rawls Collegiate Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies, but needed to jettison Rawls in favor of Dewey when her college decided to cap the number of titles a faculty member can possess. Professor Anderson is currently working on an epic multi-volume history of egalitarianism, from which her talk today is a small snippet. According to her profile in the New Yorker, Professor Anderson's work is, quote, like a long argument addressed to readers across the aisle, an attempt to make them understand and maybe to win them back. Professor Anderson's talk today reflects this noble virtue. It is an argument with none other than Max Weber himself about the pro-worker side of the Puritan work ethic that Weber somehow missed in his seminal early 20th century book, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Anderson.
So it's a tremendous pleasure to be able to address you. I wish I could be in California in person, but it's awfully convenient to be able to deliver this address from my home office. I'm going to share my screen now because I have some slides that I think you would like to see. Let's think about the work ethic, American style. Of course, we got the work ethic from England, but Americans, we have our own version. Many Americans find work central to our personal identities. We think work builds character. A lot of us are on call at all hours. We have a whole rhetoric against getting free stuff. Remember Romney in his presidential campaign? There's a stigma that attaches to being unemployed. And a lot of us are engaged in what we might be called performative workaholism, especially at new style offices such as WeWork. Against this, though, we have several critics. I'll cite firstly the late David Graeber. Unfortunately, he just died a short while ago. He wrote a fun book called Bullshit Jobs. He defines bullshit jobs as paid employment so pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee can't justify its existence, although the employee must pretend that this is not the case. I taught a course last semester on work and the work ethic, and I asked my students, how many of you worked in a bullshit job? My favorite example, about 40% of my students raised their hand. My favorite example of a bullshit job was somebody who had been hired by a firm to write reports that no one read. He knew that no one read them because he had to upload his report to a website which counted the number of times it was downloaded. 0, right? Graeber distinguishes bullshit jobs from shit jobs. Those are things like janitorial services, nurses' aides, and so forth. Shit jobs are actually socially necessary work that promote the welfare of humankind. However, they're poorly paid, they're forms of drudgery, and the people that do it, those jobs are often stigmatized. Graeber estimates that about 40% of all jobs in modern capitalist economies are bullshit jobs. They tend to be middle class, decently paid, middle management type work, but socially useless. Now, Graeber, of course, is writing in a tradition of critiques of the work ethic, so we could go back to John Maynard Keynes, a great economist who wrote in 1930, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in that essay, Keynes condemned the endless accumulation of wealth as an end in itself, as kind of a pathological end. It's a critique basically of the whole presumption of economics that that's what we, that's what everybody's doing, right? Maximizing profits, maximizing wealth. Keynes said this was nuts. He also condemned the constant postponement of leisure and enjoyment to the future, right? We got to be working now, postpone leisure to the future. That's delusional. When the future comes, we'll be too demented and broken down to enjoy leisure. And ultimately, he rejected the work ethic for an ideal of the leisure society. He accurately estimated in 1930 how prosperous we would be today, but he assumed that we would use our prosperity to cut back on the number of hours we had to work, given that it would be so easy. Only take a few hours a day to cover our necessities, and after that, we should be enjoying ourselves. He thought we should just share out the jobs, work 3 to 4 hours a day, and have fun the rest of the time. It didn't work out that way, especially not in the United States, where, in fact, we still work relentlessly and take far less vacation than we're entitled to. But of course, we could go back even earlier to Max Weber, who wrote his classic work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, towards the end of his life in 1920. And this is what he had to say in criticism of the work ethic. The Puritans, of course, invented the work ethic in the mid-17th century. And he claimed that they bestowed an amazingly good conscience in the acquisition of money. And As the work ethic secularized over time, he said that ultimately it turned into nothing more than a rationalization of the capitalist willingness, exploitation of workers' willingness to work, right? You give them an ideology where they think they have to work really hard, and then capitalists can pull a lot of profits out of that internalized work ethic. And he also condemned modern capitalist society as putting us all in an iron cage. He said the Puritan wanted to work in a calling, but we are forced to do so by the relentless competitive situation of capitalist markets. It all seems pretty grim. I think, though, it would be worthwhile for us to go back to the mid-17th century and find out what these Puritans actually believed. So let's consider the origins of the work ethic, and I take the preeminent theologian of the work ethic, Richard Baxter, Puritan minister in the mid-17th century. He wrote an enormous number of books. The one where the work ethic is most evident is called The Christian Directory. It's a 5-volume work, a comprehensive review of ethics from a Christian point of view. So what is the work ethic, or what was it in Baxter's hands? Well, everyone has to engage in disciplined work in a calling, that is a specialized occupation. God calls us to a specialized occupation, and we should work in that diligently. Let's not waste our time. No idleness here. Importantly, even the rich have to work. You can't just because you could live doesn't mean off your wealth doesn't mean you're entitled to. Everyone must work. God told Adam they had to work by the sweat of his brow to the end of his days, and Baxter cites that as a reason why even the rich must work. We also must never waste material goods. God gave the resources of the earth for human beings to use, not to waste. We shouldn't indulge in worldly pleasures or in vanities. It's an ascetic philosophy. We shouldn't indulge in covetousness. We shouldn't want more material goods than we strictly need to do our duty. This puts a limit on how we may use our wealth. We might accumulate it, but we can't really spend much on ourselves, no more than what we really need to do our duties. I will postpone for another slide later on what else we're supposed to be doing with all that money that we're making. Because indeed, Baxter also called upon us to frugally getteth and saveth as much as we can. So we have to maximize our income, then we have to save it up. What are those savings going to be used for? We'll be seeing shortly. What Weber highlighted in his great work was what I call the conservative path to the secularization of the work ethic. Weber was absolutely right to argue that the work ethic had its origins in a theological doctrine about God's will for human beings on earth, and about the desperate need that Calvinists of all stripes felt to gain assurance of salvation. And the doctrine was that you could only know that you're truly saved by working diligently and fulfilling the demands of the work ethic. But over time, Weber argued accurately that the work ethic invented by Puritans became secularized over time. And what I highlight on this slide is what I call the conservative path to secularization. And you'll see that this is a doctrine that's very familiar to us today. So the theological doctrine was that the poor stand to the rich as lazy sinners stand to the hardworking, right? That is, there's a presumption that God rewards the virtuous with wealth. And that's the sign that they're saved. And hence, if you're poor, there's probably something scandalous and sinful about you. In secular terms, this is very familiar in American conservative ideology. The idea that honor is conditional on self-sufficiency. If you're dependent on welfare or free stuff from the government, you are held in contempt, as Romney said in his famous condemnation of Democrats, half the country, right, just wants free stuff from the government. They're not self-reliant. The presumption here is that the poor are undeserving. Theologically, Baxter claimed it was a bourgeois duty to maximize profits, and you do so by putting your workers to disciplined labor. In secular terms, that turned into the ideology of shareholder capitalism, right? What's the duty of a corporation? To maximize its profits. And it also transfers into a conservative ideology in which public policy should favor capital over labor in many ways, be anti-union, lower taxes on capital income than labor income, and so forth. In order to maximize profits, you have to keep wages low. And that leads to the existence of a class of working poor. Even no matter how hard you work at a menial shit job, you're never going to get rich on that, right? Theologically, too, the Puritans were very fond of saying that he who does not work shall not eat. Again, the presumption was that if you don't have work, it must somehow be due to your own laziness, not say to macroeconomic factors that are throwing people into unemployment. Of course, in the mid-17th century, macroeconomics hadn't been invented yet, so people didn't have a clear grasp of why there were economic recessions. But today, in its secular form, we see this prominent in conservative ideology, that it prefers charity over state welfare benefits. And if the state does provide benefits, workfare is preferred over just free stuff. So we see, for instance, states being given exemptions in Medicaid expansion so that they can require recipients of Medicaid to work. In the theological doctrine, nobody should be entitled to leisure without having worked for it. As Baxter said, rest must follow work, right? And in the secular version, this is the American version, there's no unearned vacations or leave. The United States is the only rich country in the world that doesn't have guaranteed paid vacations. Theologically, Baxter understood work as a kind of imposed ascetic discipline, right? One of the values of work is it's a kind of ascetic discipline, so it keeps your mind, if you're very busy working, it keeps your mind off sins, right? No time for lust and gluttony and these other things, because your nose is to the grindstone. The secular version of this is what I call the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. That is, employers ruling workers' lives and making sure that they don't have they're not stealing time from the employer while they're at work. And even their leisure time might be supervised, say, through random drug tests, so that they could be fired if there's any trace of marijuana in their system. Graeber was right about all that, but he was wrong to think that that secularized, conservative, anti-worker version of the work ethic was the only side of the work ethic. My argument is that there's another side of the work ethic that was very pro-worker. And it also, you can find this in Richard Baxter's Christian Directory and in other work of other Puritans writing at the time in England. Baxter insisted on the dignity of all workers. Why was that? Because everyone is called to a socially necessary occupation, and no matter how menial it is doing God's will on earth, right? Even the most menial are doing God's work and hence need to be honored on that account. Everyone is entitled to meaningful work, which he defined as honest labors profitable to the Commonwealth. Okay? Everyone's entitled to this. Workers are entitled to relief from employer abuses. He really attacks employers who are abusive to their workers. He says, rule them not tyrannically. He says workers are entitled to safe and healthful conditions. He insists that workers are entitled to fair and living wages. And workers, if they're poor, have a right to charity. And also, if people are disabled and sick and unable to work, those people also have a right to charity. And ultimately, the ultimate reward of diligent labor in this life is the saints' everlasting rest, as you get to heaven, right? And then you get eternal leisure in communion with God. Baxter insisted that the rich have very strict duties, among which is productive labor. God hath strictly commanded labor to all, he says. None of those lazy landlords. They're like drones in the nest, right? Just get rid of them. They're useless. It's only the worker bees who should be honored. He opposed all methods of what we might call mere wealth extraction, where people aren't doing anything to promote human welfare, but just extracting wealth from other people. He said it's a prison and constant calamity to be tied to spend one's life in doing little good at all to others, though he should grow rich by it himself. I want us to think about that one. How many business models today are based just on mere wealth extraction? Baxter knew that that was totally wrong. He was an excellent business ethicist, and he argued against unfair and exploitative business models, which, by the way, he called forms of oppression. What are those models? Well, he says, don't tread on your brethren as stepping stones of your own advancement, right? He opposed this whole idea inherent in meritocracy today, that the point of life is a great race up a ladder of esteem and wealth, right? Where in the race you get to scramble over other people in the race to the top. That's to be condemned. He insisted, do not injure your inferiors who are unable to resist. If somebody's vulnerable, you should take advantage. You should not take advantage of them. That's an abuse. Put into application, he attacked monopolists, usurers, hucksters of all type, and grocers. These are people, and grocers are people who try to corner the market and artificially raise the price of things. Consider, for instance, people who bought up all the available hand sanitizer and then sold it at quadruple the price, right? That's engrossing. And Baxter saw that it was wrong. He also objected to unfair evictions of tenants. Locke actually is also a theorist of the work ethic. And in a little notice essay called Venditio, he argued against price discrimination. So if somebody's poor and desperate, you're not entitled to take advantage of that fact and charge them a higher price than you would charge to anyone else at that place and time. No price discrimination. Imagine how many business models are dependent on price discrimination today. You probably couldn't run an airline without it. Or indeed, under our dysfunctional healthcare system, right? The whole healthcare system is running off price discrimination. Baxter also invented the doctrine of effective altruism. You know, Peter Singer, of course, has made this doctrine famous. But when I was reading Richard Baxter, I saw the exact same doctrine deduced in his works. And I immediately sent an email to Peter. And I said, Peter, are you aware that you're just channeling the ethical thinking of a mid-17th century Puritan theologian? He was delighted to learn that fact. So let's see how Baxter derives the duty of effective altruism. It's a very clever argument. This is how it goes. Remember, in the work ethic, you have a duty to if you have a choice between a lower paying and a higher paying job, you should take the higher paying job. That's exactly what Singer says in The Life You Can Save. Maximize your income. But remember, you're not allowed to waste anything. You can't just pile up all that wealth and not put it to use. Or as Locke says, right, you can't pile up those acorns and let them rot. He does imagine that you're allowed to pile up all that gold, and because that won't rot. But Baxter thought, no, you can't just pile up. You have to put that gold too. You have to spend it wisely. Okay, but you can't spend it on self-indulgence and luxury, right? Because the doctrine is an ascetic doctrine. So how are you going to spend it usefully if you can't spend it on yourself? Baxter's answer was, you have to spend it on public works, and you have to spend it on our needy brethren. There it is. Doctrine of effective altruism popping right out of the Protestant work ethic. Or as he said, the portions or comeliest clothing of your children must rather be neglected than that poor be suffered to perish. It's an argument almost identical to Singer's argument that if you see a drowning child in a pond, you have a duty to wade in there, even at the ruin of your own very nice clothes, right, in order to save that child. Baxter already thought of that. And so what I argue is that there's also a progressive path to secularization, and one that honors workers. Theologically, Baxter said workers should be honored as following a sacred calling. In secular terms, what that means is that all workers are entitled to dignity and meaningful work. Theologically, Baxter and other Puritan theologians at the time argued for freedom of occupational choice. In secular terms, the same thing. Nobody should be consigned to some occupation. Just, you shouldn't be limiting people's opportunities. Those opportunities should be open so people have choices. Theologically, workers are entitled to a frugal living wage. When that gets secularized, it turns into the idea that workers are entitled to high and rising wages. Theologically, there's a right and duty to charity. But when that gets secularized, it turns into a right to social insurance. Theologically, diligent workers are entitled to leisure in the next life. But in secular terms, you bring those rewards of hard labor into this life, right? And you get the idea that the state should mandate maximum hours, paid vacation and leaves, such as is common in most Western European countries. Finally, theologically, there's this idea that work is internalized, right? The duty to work is internalized. We can discipline ourselves. Everyone is capable. everyone, every soul is eligible for salvation, provided that they work diligently in the work ethic. And in secular terms, that turns into the idea that workers are perfectly capable of governing themselves at work. And so you get ideologies of self-employment and cooperative work, right? That workers don't really need bosses, right? They can manage themselves, either as individuals or as part of groups. The legacy, then, I argue, is in classical liberalism. That's where the progressive pro-worker work ethic was secularized. And it resulted in a bunch of political economists, classical political economists, who defended the rights of workers. So we see Smith, Tom Paine, Abe Lincoln opposing all forms of unfree labor, including slavery, serfdom, debt peonage, indentured servitude. Smith himself had special opprobrium for unpaid apprenticeship. Think about the unpaid internships that we expect our young adults to work at today. Smith disapproved. Locke, Smith, and Mill all agreed that property rights are founded in labor. That's a very pro-worker doctrine. They all accepted the labor theory of value. Like, who's doing the real work around here, right? It's the worker. They're the ones who are producing value, not the lazy landowner. Smith famously argued in The Wealth of Nations in favor of high and rising wages. Condorcet and Paine famously argued in favor of universal social insurance, old age pensions, disability payments, so forth. John Stuart Mill argued that in principle, the state can limit the length of the working day, have maximum hours laws. Tom Paine and John Stuart Mill both argued in favor of universal self-employment, or in Mill's case, workers' cooperatives as the ultimate end of capitalism. But what is the work ethic today? Let's bring all these thoughts up to the 21st century. What do we see today? We see something rather different, okay? So here we could see that something happened around the mid-1970s. From 1950 to the mid-1970s, we see GDP growth and wage growth coinciding almost exactly. But then around the mid-1970s, hourly compensation stagnates even as productivity continues to increase. So we see a widening gap, okay, between compensation of ordinary workers and productivity. Well, where is all that money going then if it's not going into the pockets of the people who are doing the work? Well, some of it's going to CEOs, right? They've made out big time. You see, back in 1970, in 2018 dollars, maybe they were making a little more than $100,000 a year on average, okay? And today you can see, right, their compensation has skyrocketed to many multiples of a worker's income. We can also see alarmingly high rates of in-work poverty. Okay, the United States is the red bar over on the right. Only Greece and Spain among the OECD countries have worse rates of working poverty. Warren Buffett, I think, put the point well. He says there's class warfare, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. Now, against all this, we do see a difference between now and the mid-17th century, where the rich were the idle landlords who just collected rents and didn't do any useful labor. It seems today that the rich are mostly working. Okay, and here you could see that indeed higher income workers, the professional managerial class, actually works longer hours than lower income workers. And so maybe they deserve it, right? That's what we think. That's what many of us think, especially in America. They're working like crazy all the time, right? So maybe they deserve that immense wealth. But I think we need to look at this more closely in light of what we know about the origins of the work ethic. I think it's very important not to confuse busyness, just being busy all the time, with work that enhances the welfare of other people. That is, people other than oneself and shareholders who aren't doing a lick of work. Okay. There are lots of ways of being very, very busy that just amount to the extraction of wealth or oppression of other people, right? And that was what Baxter observed. So we can ask ourselves about 21st century capitalist businesses, what is the business model based on? Is it just extracting wealth like vulture capitalist private equity, right? Where you basically put down 10 or 20% of the value of a firm. 80% is borrowed, you load it up with debt, and then in order to service the debt, you cut the wages of all the workers. You dilute the brand and extract the value for the brand by now producing your products at lower quality with lower quality inputs until people realize that the brand isn't worth anything anymore, right? And maybe eventually, after you pull out hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation for your supposedly brilliant management, the company can't actually service its debt anymore, goes bankrupt, and sends all those workers into unemployment. This is not an uncommon thing, okay? Does the business model exploit the vulnerable? Think about surprise medical bills. We have private equity companies who set up emergency surgeons in network hospitals, but the ER room is out of network. People don't know that. They go to the ER and suddenly they're stuck with tens of thousands of dollars of bills that they weren't expecting because they thought they were going to an in-network service provider. Or you could pump up the cost of insulin. Even old drugs that are off patent now are costing insane amounts of money for diabetics. It's a business model based on misleading people. Look at all those for-profit scam schools. It's Betsy DeVos just insisted that students have to pay off the debts, even though the schools say promise to turn you into an expert coder, but they trained you on obsolete equipment and software so that you're totally unfit to do any programming on modern technology. Or maybe you're just selling nutritional supplements in a multi-level marketing scheme, right? It's just really just a Ponzi scheme. And you're making your money by enticing other people with a false promise that they'll get rich through self-employment, when in fact, you're just extracting a lot of money from them. Or maybe your business model depends on shifting risks to the vulnerable. Very common for corporations to pull out the money invested in workers' pensions when the stock market is high. And then when it crashes, they just declare bankruptcy. And then the workers are left with nothing and they have to go on the insurance, okay, which doesn't pay nearly as much. Or maybe the model is just undermining future generations, like the whole fossil fuel industry. Okay, make lots of profits now, send the rest of humanity into burning hell. Or maybe, as with social media, you're just making money by spreading hatred, propaganda, conspiracy theories, and undermining democracy. Look at Facebook. Baxter would have condemned all these models because you're not doing anything worthwhile, worthy of any income at all, if you are not on net promoting the welfare of humanity. I'm going to actually skip this slide because I want to make room for Q&A. Just want to point out that even though Baxter said you should take the higher paying job over the lower one, he also warned that you should mortify your own lusts, right? What makes you think you need so much that you can oppress other people? You're not allowed to make more money by oppression. And we should ask ourselves, what's the point of accumulating billions of dollars that you can never spend? Okay, I want you to think about that. All right, well, maybe we could spend it on philanthropy, right? And indeed, there's a direct line of thought from Baxter to Andrew Carnegie to Bill Gates and Singer, who advocate effective altruism. I want to suggest, though, and Baxter would have agreed, that however you end up giving away your money, that can't justify the abuses of power by which that wealth was extracted in the first place. It goes directly to Andrew Carnegie, who in fact had incredibly dangerous steel mills with shocking accidents and mortality rates among his workers. And furthermore, we have to consider that individual remedies don't alter structural injustices. If you have a dangerous factory, okay, and you're making profits because you're not investing in safety equipment, it's just not justified. And Baxter was right when he said workers are entitled to healthy and safe conditions. Think about slaughterhouses today, where high percentages of workers are dying from COVID because they're not even issued basic personal protective equipment. Let's now reflect on Graeber and Keynes's critiques of the work ethic in light of its origins. Graeber complained about what he called the spiritual violence of bullshit jobs. And I think he's right about this. He complained of the indignity of being consigned to uselessness, work that really isn't doing anything useful. It undermines people's agency to be forced to be busy doing stuff that is useless, like writing reports that nobody reads. He also pointed out there was something humiliating about being ordered to do a worthless task. Sometimes bosses do that just as a kind of power play. Or maybe your task is just to slake the boss's vanity. Baxter definitely would have disapproved. Graeber also observed that in prisons, prisoners actually complain about being deprived of work, which is often used as a punishment. Prisoners want something useful to do. Just being lying around useless in your cell is very frustrating. It drives people crazy. What I want to suggest is that Graeber's complaints here are actually better motivated by the progressive work ethic than by the leisure ideal that he and Keynes advocated. What he really says is, what I think the implication is that what people really need is meaningful, dignified, well-paid work. And so I'm going to end with a thought of Milton's. So Milton's writing at the same time as Baxter. In Paradise Lost, he reflects on the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden, and God's demand that Adam work by the sweat of his brow to the end of his days, which was considered as a curse. Milton disagrees. He says, with labor, I must earn my bread. What harm is that? Idleness would have been worse. So I want to leave you with this thought that there actually is a good side to the work ethic, one that honors workers and affords them appropriate leisure, paid, and meaningful work. And that's these are goals that I think are worthwhile for us today. So there's something to be learned from a 17th century Puritan minister. Thank you.
Super, Elizabeth. Thank you. That was really wonderful exercise in kind of intellectual jujitsu on the work ethic here. And just as a reminder to folks, we're still being recorded in the Q&A. So just either raise your hand in the chat by saying I have a question, just type it in there. I'll proceed in the order at which people have questions, or just write your question to the chat and I'll read it. But I will exercise my privileges as moderator to ask the first question, which is one of the things that's really striking here is it's as if Weber read every other page of his primary sources, which is particularly striking. I mean, one of my lodestars as a professor, as a teacher, is Weber's exhortation that we should all sort of be governed by the pursuit of inconvenient facts for one's party opinions. And it's as if, what you've done is present the inconvenient facts for his particular party opinion about the work ethic. And I guess the question I have as a historian, thinking about the time he wrote, trying to understand, what do you suppose explains the fact that he missed every other page in the very sources? I mean, you focused on Baxter, presumably there are other Protestant theologians.
Oh, and I talk about them in my book, but
yeah. So why do you suppose he missed that? All of these inconvenient facts you present to his the central thesis of the Protestant ethic.
So what I think happened was that what I call the progressive work ethic went through not just Locke, Smith, and Mill. You can even find it in Marx. It turns out the very first work of Marx's that we have preserved is his graduation exam from Gymnasium, in which the set topic was on the choice of a young man's vocation. And he gave actually a perfect rendition of the work ethic right there, where, what we need is work that will promote human interests, the welfare of other people, and thereby develop our own skills and ability through service to other people. And indeed, right there, you could see the core ideal of the 1844 manuscripts. Now, this is an ultra secular version, right? Right. By the time you get to 1844, he's a hardcore atheist. Right. And I think the progressive secularization of the work ethic, you can trace right through Marx to social democracy. But it's so ultra secularized by that point that it's easy to miss the connections. But that's what I'm drawing out in my history. And a big difference is, even in somebody like Mill, there's a lot of Mill has a lot of hand wringing, like, will the workers really adopt the work ethic? He thinks ultimately they will, but he's worried about it. Whereas by the time you get to the Social Democrats and the German Social Democratic Party, they just take it for granted. Of course, the workers have internalized the work ethic, so they don't wring their hands over it, right? They are working really hard. Just look at them. They're in the factories.
Great. There are a couple questions that that go to this point. I don't understand why the promise of leisure in the next life for those who conform to the work ethic should be considered as a pro-worker aspect of the Protestant work ethic. It seems to be a promise for those who endure overwork, likely with maximum wage laws enforced in that time, and suffer well in this lifetime, would enjoy a blessed afterlife. But how is this promise pro-worker?
Well, it doesn't become fully pro-worker until you secularize it and bring the rewards promised in the next life into this life. Okay. But still, you do have the sense that, look, if you really believe in heaven, that really is a huge reward.
There's a comment here, and I don't know if you want to comment on it, that regarding effective altruism, my sense is that much of that community roots its charity giving in arguments for efficiency, do good better, not human dignity, as Baxter seems to. In other words, EA, presumably
Yes.
you.
Right. And I think that's really nice. I mean, yeah, don't waste anything, right? I mean, right, you don't even want to waste your charitable dollar.
Right.
That no waste idea, that efficiency, right, is like deeply embedded in economic thinking too, right?
Okay.
We're obsessed with it.
Stephen Vogel, you want to ask your question?
Sure. So you have made a very persuasive case for kind of a progressive version of the work ethic over a conservative one. But that kind of only begets the question why the progressive version does not seem to resonate in our American society today, and why the conservative one is still so powerful. I guess I sort of understand it with respect to the undeserving poor side, but I'm really puzzled by the deserving rich side of the coin. You know, why is it that we continue to value or to say that the rich are deserving when they have exploitative business models? You know, in other words, richness that is derived from exploitation rather than productivity. That kind of seems antithetical to the idea of a work ethic. So why is that so resonant?
I think that's a great question. So another way to put the point is, why is there no socialism in the United States? Right, because if there were, right, that's the progressive work ethic right there. Right. No, I think a lot of this just has to do with the legacies of slavery and the fact that the United States always had, right, this very, deep ideological rationalizations of extraordinarily abusive and harsh treatment of workers. And even after emancipation, you had massive resistance to that. And the legacies today are that many of those modes of treatment, although somewhat milder, that's still that ingrained sense among a lot of capitalists that they're entitled to treat workers like that, right? In these horrible ways. I mean, we see that today with the pandemic, socially necessary workers basically like being given nothing and like sent into disease-ridden things, and capitalists saying we want freedom from liability for the dangerous conditions into which we're putting acknowledged socially necessary workers. So yeah, I mean, it's like saying, why don't we have a left in the United States that's really robust? That's why, right?
Jim, I see you raising your hand there, but I'm going to follow the cue that I see in the chat. We'll come back to you. Just post in the chat that you have a question, just in case I forget. Rakesh, did I ask the question, or do you want to follow up on the question that I attributed to you before?
Sure. I'll follow up just really briefly. We have the critique of existing capitalism in terms of your progressive labor work ethic. I'm wondering if we could pay a little more attention on what we mean by kind of socially productive labor there.
Yeah.
Whether that really can be the standpoint for this criticism. Because you mentioned Marx, but for Marx, labor also has to be not just socially productive, but it also has to be spontaneous or creative. And that it seems to me that if you make the critique of existing capitalism just from the perspective of kind of socially productive or socially validated productive labor, and how capitalism fails to engage people in labor that is socially productive, or does not provide socially productive labor, or rewards capitalists who are not organizing socially productive labor, that if that becomes the pivot of critique, we would then lose also the struggle to make labor creative, suited to people's highest capacities. That's also part of the critique that comes out of parts of for example, the 1844 manuscripts in Marx, but I don't think is part of we can't derive that from a Protestant work ethic, no matter how progressively we see it. So it seems to me that I would like for you to specify what is the nature of the labor in terms of which you're critiquing the existing capitalist system.
Right. So I actually do think that the elements of it are there, right? Because the whole idea of a calling is that God has endowed you with special talents and, for helping other people in particularized ways. Maybe you want to, go into healthcare, right? Heal the sick. Or maybe you want to go into education, right? Teach people, right? Convey knowledge and skills. Right. There is this idea that, you should specialize in your talents so that you can bring them to a high point. And let's keep in mind that for the Puritans, this is really before we have the Industrial Revolution, where you have a micro division of labor that Smith famously described in the pin factory, where your whole life is productive life is consigned, fitting the head of a pin on the tip of a pin, or maybe sharpening the point or something. Right. In the Puritans' days, the paradigmatic worker was a craftsman. And when you think about this, it's a multi-skilled person. Like, you can make an entire shoe or an entire boot. But not only that, you're running your own business, right? If you're a master craftsman, you've got your own shop, so you have to know accounting or bookkeeping at least, and, relating to customers. This is all a multi-skilled thing. You're creating a whole product, and right, you're running your own shop. It's meaningful. You're people need shoes, right? And of course, in those days, they didn't anticipate the micro division of labor that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. They're thinking of people who are producing whole products or whole services. And that is, and Marx's ideal of unalienated labor has the same thing to it, right? The idea that you serve others, that through the development of multifarious skills in yourself, and then exercising in service of other people. But that was already paradigmatic labor for the Puritans, because it's pre-Industrial Revolution.
There's a question here in the chat. How do you make effective ethical appeals in a post-Christian, pluralistic moral environment? For example, most of the West today. If Jeff Bezos was listening to this talk, on what basis should he feel compelled to change his behavior?
Right. Well, look, as the work ethic secularized, right, we detach it from its theological presuppositions. And we bring the promised rewards from the next life into this life. But Bezos, the idea that you're entitled to make a lot of money at the expense of other people, how could that possibly be? That doesn't fly as an argument. Why should anyone accept? Remember, the infrastructure of laws and regulations under which markets are constructed is a public good. And as a public good, the details of its construction have to be justifiable to everyone, and not just to the 1/10 of 1%.
Erica, you're next in the queue.
So my question has been maybe asked in other words by other people a little bit, but I'm wondering, considering the problems of our work ethic today, do you see the solution in kind of a practical sense, like where do we go from here, as a process of reviving this progressive side of the moral of the work ethic that you're talking about, that we just need to understand it better and implement it better? Or is there actually room to kind of come up with something new, a new way of understanding our relationship to work and production and each other through collective debate or other other forms?
Well, primarily what I'm trying to do in this talk is, it's a critique of neoliberalism, representing it as just the latest version of this very harsh conservative work ethic, right? It's really just a retread of this harsh work ethic that really it's no justification once you understand, why people are poor, for instance. They're not poor because they're lazy. They're poor because we've set up a structure of opportunities that consigns some segment of the population, no matter how hard they work, to poverty. That can't possibly be justified, right? and what I argue is, look, Americans in particular still have, the work ethic is deep, but we can turn it to better ends when we appreciate the other side of it.
Jamie, you're next.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Anderson. My name is Jamie McCallum. I teach at Middlebury College, and I've used your work a few times in my classes. I'm curious about the relationship between this progressive work ethic and like the politics of work hours. You cited some data early on in your presentation. Is there a way in which you imagine the progressive work ethic idea being used to mobilize for greater support for example, a shorter hours movement? Or does it actually help to prop up sort of like the dignity of all labor, thereby tending to reinforce the idea that, well, work for all kinds of reasons is good and 40 hours is fine and blah, blah, blah. And I'm wondering if you see a connection between the ideology there and the kind of the ability to make an argument for shorter hours.
Yeah. So, I mean, the short idea just is that work is entitled to
Morgan Miller
rewards.
Plumbing has been serving the Kansas.
And some of these rewards are going to be in terms of leisure, not just like income. And another dimension of this, which is very important, is that Baxter did represent women's unpaid domestic labor as promoting the welfare of humanity and fully fulfilling the demands of the work ethic. So he saw, he still has a picture of a gender division of labor where women are doing all the child rearing, but he said that's education, right? It's moral development. That's also like socially necessary labor, even if it's not making money. So if you go back to the origins, even though he said men should maximize their income, right? He did recognize there's all this valuable stuff that people are doing, promoting the welfare of other people that isn't part of the marketed labor system.
Luis, you're next.
Hi. So you spoke a bit to my question, which is about the relationship of these different work ethics to specialization and the division of labor. So I guess I'd be curious to hear you talk more specific. I mean, even within the liberal one, there's a split between Smith and Marx, and sort of what specialization does to the enjoyment of work and the fulfillment of it. So now that we are sort of past the Industrial Revolution, sort of what are the prospects of reviving this sort of liberal work ethic in relation to specialization? So is it completely predicated on a reorganization of production and of the organization of work, or is there like an adaptation of it?
Yeah, so I mean, we're well past the time when, say, the Fordist assembly line is sort of the paradigmatic form of industrial labor. I mean, there is a little bit of that, but it's actually pretty marginal in our today's information knowledge economy. I do think, though, that there are independent issues that have to do with the way, since the mid-1970s, a lot of work has been turned into gig work, temp work, you no longer have a career, you don't even have a job anymore, you just have like all these tasks, right? And then you have to desperately assemble all of these tasks into a barely survivable, life in precarity. Like, this is horrible. And I think part of this, though, what we have to recognize is that a lot of the way labor is divided today just is driven by, the cult of profit maximization, right? Where you outsource labor, turn it into temp labor and so forth. And I don't see a compelling reason to do that. One of the consequences of that is that it's abolished the promotion ladder. Back in the 50s, you could start off in the mailroom and then make it up to middle management, right? They don't have that anymore because all the mailroom people are outsourced. It's not necessary. I do think we should reconsider the division of labor to create more like whole jobs that can sustain people and that provide opportunities for, the development of a fuller skill set than just scrambling, as a task rabbit or something.
Here's a question I have sent to me privately, but it's in the chat. It says, with the combined crises of climate change and inequality, I don't think the right interpretation of frugal living wage is high rising wages. With adequate government services, healthcare, childcare, education, the focus should be on living wages for all workers with CEO pay not more than 10 times the average worker pay. Do you think the focus not on rising wages, but on living wages and a sustainable economy might be the progressive work ethic?
Oh, yeah. So this brings us back to sort of how social democracy transformed the work ethic. And a lot of it was focused on decommodifying labor. Absolutely core to every social democratic program. And that means that you don't want to make people rely on labor income to have a decent life. And so part of that involves pretty rich public provision. So a lot of your Western European countries, you got free college, for instance, right? You don't have to like go into debt to get higher education. You have publicly provided healthcare or healthcare at like highly affordable rates. Right, and so the idea is that even though Smith called for high and rising wages, right, in the social democratic vision, you don't have to get it through labor income at all. A lot of what we need, provision of fundamental needs, is provided through a very rich package of social insurance.
Glory, you're next. You out there, Glory?
Hi. Hi. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself and turn my camera on. So my question is related to this last one. It has to do with where something like universal basic income might fit into your response to the last question. So some scholars have argued that something like UBI would actually give workers more leverage in bargaining over things like wages and benefits, while others see universal basic income, if it is provided, as more reason for big corporations to actually turn their eyes away from giving workers more power. But it also has the potential to maybe separate the division, or sorry, separate, work from labor. So I just wanted to know what your take on that was.
Yeah, well, for any UBI proposal, you got to look at the details, right? In the Silicon Valley version of the UBI, right, robots turn the massive workers into just unemployed people. And then you just kind of like provide for them and prevent the revolution by giving them a UBI. That's not really a very great vision. But, you know, and there are other ways to package it where it could play a useful role, but I don't think it, you know, a lot of it has to do with whether you see the UBI as replacing other benefits or supplementing them. So I do think that, you know, like healthcare is like, everybody needs it. And, you know, if you get sick, you would spend more than your annual basic income just on taking care of that. You have nothing left, right? So you still need a very rich package of social insurance to make a UBI work. And that's why I think ultimately it's kind of a supplemental rather than like the silver bullet that solves all our problems and replaces, you know, the welfare state.
Jonathan asks in the chat, does the progressive work ethic embrace productivism? If so, doesn't that cut against Keynes's book and others like Sen? Why should we view work as virtuous rather than a necessary evil?
Look, work just is activity that promotes the welfare of other people. Okay. And it doesn't have to be marketed. It doesn't have to be embodied in a physical object, right? Most of the work we do is actually more service oriented these days anyways. It doesn't require the accumulation of stuff. So a lot of like the environmentalist critique is really against like materialism in the sense of like just like gigantic houses and big flashy cars, like actual material stuff that pollutes a lot in order to produce that stuff. But it does, you know, it doesn't take a lot of pollution to like stage a play or, you know, teach somebody arithmetic. I mean, there's some, I mean, right, but it's a lot less when you're not like just consuming massive amounts of the Earth's resources. And that's the kind of economy that I think, you know, we're already, you know, moving towards and could do so much more if we get off our conspicuous consumption and esteemed competition through the display of material goods.
We have about 10 minutes, and I think we're going to get through all the questions that are remaining, starting with Richard. Thanks for your patience, Richard.
Hi, yeah, so it's a question about Baxter and then about what's in something in Baxter we haven't talked about directly, I think, and how we would secularize that. Does he have a bias to sort of physical labor as opposed to intellectual labor, or does he make a distinction?
No, he doesn't really. So, you know, in defining women's work as essentially education, right? I mean, it's mental labor.
So he's even, they're both meaningful forms of labor for him.
Very meaningful, absolutely, yes. And in fact, he condemned the idle rich for failing to educate their daughters, right? Because that would be like, what can these idle daughters do? Because, you know, the housework and the child rearing is fobbed off to nannies and governesses and so forth, and house cleaners. So what are these young ladies doing? Well, you know, they're like playing cards and gossiping. Like, this is worthless, right? They need stuff too that will help humanity.
Jennifer, still out there? Oh, there you are.
Yeah, thank you. This is Jennifer Proudruger from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for your talk and your body of work generally. It's I really admire it. My question is more closely linked to health and healthcare and health insurance, social insurance more broadly, but specifically health insurance. And of course, you know, taking your line of reasoning further, of course, the productivity is linked to health insurance because healthier people are more productive. Yeah. And that bolsters your, you know, liberal work ethic. But that has a dark side too, because if we justify health insurance and health care and access only by work ethic or productivity, then we're missing out on failing to observe the other reasons why we value health insurance and health care. And what we see in the natural experiments all over the world is that we have different models that sort of take, because it's a natural link. I really like what you're doing, but it has a concern. So, we have the Bismarck and the Beveridge model. We have countries in East Asia, and a lot of them have started with that link between employment and work and health insurance. But ultimately, you have to de-link it then to get back to a much more comprehensive and effective approach to health insurance. So I wondered if you had anything further to say about that. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. So remember, if you trace out the progressive line of Baxter's thought, we all have duties to help all people, including the disabled, people who are too sick to work. Right? These are universal duties to all of humanity. And Baxter, nobody had ideas of social insurance back then, so he rendered those duties in terms of charity. But, the great advance of social insurance, and this was something that Condorcet and Payne already anticipated, is that you can render these goods to people without the stigmatization and dependence on the wills of other people that happens when you deliver these goods through charity.
Right, which is very problematic.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Abby, did you want to pose your question directly? Is that okay?
Absolutely,
Thank
no
you.
worries at all. Yeah, and thank you, Professor, for speaking to us today. So I wanted to ask by what you meant more specifically by your secularizing of the promises of rest or leisure, and whether or not you imagine this as leisure integrated through our entire lives, so provisions being provided for people to take more sick days, as you have mentioned, or if it's more of an approach of working when most have the capacity to do so, and reserving that leisure for other, like prioritizing senior care maybe, or prioritizing people who are more advanced in what would be imagined as a linear career, and just what your thoughts more generally about that kind of distinction was.
Right. So, I even though I personally internalized the work ethic, and I really do, like, just in my own life, like I can't even enjoy myself until I've gotten my day's work done. But really, leisure is a human good, right? We need to relax, spend time with friends, and it's just a very important part of having a rich life, and we can't just postpone it until we're retired, right? And children need this too. I mean, one of the weird things about American culture is, at least outside of the hyper anxious professional managerial class, we give our children enormous leisure, these incredibly long summers, right? But then as soon as they hit working age, they're nose to the grindstone. They don't get a paid day off. It's appalling. Why do we do this? It's not just children who need leisure. We all need leisure. In Europe, everybody's got paid vacations. I think in Denmark, they have something like 6 or 7 weeks of paid vacation and a bunch of holidays on top of it. It's shocking. American workers have 0 guaranteed paid days off. We're the only rich country in the world that has 0. Okay. Workers, if you're a retail worker, you don't even get Thanksgiving off in a lot of places, right? It's crazy. So leisure is just essential for human flourishing, and that has to be part, like, if our duty is to like promote human flourishing, then, right, that means workers need time off while they're working and not just, when they retire.
I'm going to ask the last question since there's no others in the queue, since we have a minute or two left. I've been reading some of the recent books that have come out that have, Sandel's being the most prominent example, the critiques of meritocracy, which of course is a term that's coined in the 1950s. It's done satirically. It's a fun sort of critique to sort of bring and introduce to students, all of whom think of themselves as having won the race to Berkeley, as sort of sort of winning that meritocracy race. I'm wondering how you think about the work that you've presented here in dialogue with that sort of critique meritocracy literature, and where
absolutely.
Sort of where it fits in this sort of Puritan work ethic stream.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sandel actually does show the historical roots of meritocracy in the work ethic. In a part of his book, he goes back that far. And it is part of this obsessive kind of, treadmill vision. Right. And, Mill, by the way, directly criticizes, he has a little essay, actually, maybe it's in his political economy, but I think he also has an essay on civilization, in which he criticizes this ideal of progress in civilization, which is really just trying to scramble up the ladder of success. He says, well, that means you're like trampling on people on the lower rungs of the ladder on the race up. And what is the insanity to which we're putting students at elite schools today? The insane competition getting into super selective schools. It's nuts. And then they continue it while they're in college. I can't believe how insanely busy my students are, because they're not just like doing academic work. Like, there's this huge scramble for unpaid internships, and they got a million extracurriculars going on. A lot of my students, they're even earning wages, and not for as part of like financial aid or anything, but like they're serving tables at the local restaurants. I tell them, what are you doing that for? Crack the books. Because they don't need the money. That's the thing. It's that they actually, U of M students, the vast majority of them don't need actually to make the money. They're not working class.
Well, Elizabeth, your profile captured you quite well. Thank you so much for being here with us virtually.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Today. And on behalf of everybody here, have a good weekend. And
yeah,
you in person live at some point in the very near future. So,
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a nice weekend.